So it's one of these things where women consistently date the men that they complain about. This is a situation where they finally won the argument in the culture war argument, where they kept complaining about a certain type of guy, but they were dating that guy. And what's happened is the men who just don't listen, the men who don't listen to Disney, the men who don't listen to big tech with their dating advice, they're the ones who do extremely well with women. But often they're called, misogynists, or people will say this person's controlling or grooming or something like that. That's kind of the language that's used. Now, don't get me wrong. There are men who are misogynists and there are men who groom women. I'm not saying that isn't the case. What's happened, though, is that seems to be like a catch-all phrase for any man who is, really good with women now. And so what's happened is that sort of like these traditional masculine features. And by the way, you guys can look it up if you think I'm exaggerating. The American Psychological Association said that traditional masculinity was harmful and called it a disorder. This is not me making this up. You can look it up yourself. You should also look up Jordan Peterson's comments on this. He said that it was scandalous. He said that it was anti-truth. That's probably the best way to describe it. The concepts that basically, when men are taught to be masculine, it makes them different from women. And that's the problem, is that society, more and more as we get further and further away from a survival scenario, there's an attempt to make men and women the same. And the more you try to make them the same, then things like the fact that men are, 200% stronger in their upper body, or the fact that men desire in general, like for instance, the median man would put him in the top 1% as far as desiring a variety of sexual partners, things like that. Men's desire for status, which far outpaces women. When you look at those kind of things, that makes us different. Making us different is not egalitarian. And that's why these type of beliefs are not pushed. The concept that men suffer is something that has never been embraced by academia. If you were to do right now, if you had a class in some college university basically saying how men suffer, just that's what you call the course. And it basically went over the fact that men are far more likely to suffer from mental illness. They're far more likely to be homeless. They're far more likely to lose their job. They're far more likely to be divorced, to be cheated on. There's so many other things that can happen that you can talk about. Being left in a divorce, 7 to 80% of divorces are initiated by women. If you were to go over this, men are far, 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 like something like 9 times more likely to take their own life. If you were to have a college course on this, the course would be obviously boycotted. No one would allow a course like that where you were talking about the concept of men suffering. Because academia refused to discuss the concept of men suffering, this is where things like the manosphere and the red pill movement, rightfully or wrongfully, came out and started addressing these issues, because academia refused to. And Professor Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institute came out and said very eloquently on my show, he said, the reason why Andrew Tate happened was because we would not have a discussion about this, because we refused to accept the fact that men were suffering. And so that's kind of where the situation is now. So what's happened, like I said, as men have had a necessity in society, or men were a necessity in society because they were the ones that built the fortification and protected the tribe from predation. They protected the tribe from invaders. And now we've got to a point where those things that made men useful are no longer necessary in society. And by the way, to some extent, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that if I have a daughter, she can buy a Glock. It's good. I'm not complaining about that part of life. But what's happened instead is that now we just got into a society where it's like those masculine traits that were necessary that men had. Like, for instance, we talk about upper body muscle, like strength. Men are far more aggressive, assertive. Men are far more ambitious. And this largely has to do with the fact that they have 17 times as much testosterone as women. Those things are just not being, they're not being rewarded anymore. And so we have what Richard Reeves might call a group of surplus men. When 60% of college enrollees are female, what happens is those women start to make more and more money. And what you would expect is, as women make more money, they should not need to desire men who make more money. But instead, we see the opposite is the case. Women on average, when surveyed, say they like about 1.65 to 1. So about they want their man to make about 65% more than them on average. So if a woman makes 100 grand, she wants a man who makes 165 grand. Well, I mean, if you do the math, and only, I believe, 17% of the population makes $100,000 a year. I think if you make $134,000 a year, that puts you in the top 10%. That's 10% of men that these women are now competing for, especially if they went to college, which more and more are going to college. They're making better livings, and they want men who make more money than them. Then the pool of men that they have to choose from becomes smaller and smaller. And the majority of men, like a lot of the guys who are going to be watching this, a lot of guys who've been swiping on dating apps for years and having no luck, you're just wondering why this isn't working out for you. And this is part of the reason why. It's just it is a dilemma of perceived choice. A lot of times we think we have choices that we don't have. Like, for instance, going to a used car lot, seeing all these cars, remember, like seeing some that you can't even afford and not being able to make a decision. That's what some women are going through whenever they go on dating apps and they left swiped on 500-600 men. In their mind, they're like, well, I could get these guys to date me. And the reality is they could get them for short-term access, but not for long-term access. And I think the discrepancy between the two is part of the reason why you're seeing a lot of women make so many bad decisions. And I think conversely, you could say the same thing about pornography with men. That's causing men to make horrible decisions in their life. And then finally, I haven't even gotten to this, just this horrible obesity epidemic that we have in this country. The obesity epidemic is part of the reason why it's so funny, because we talk about this super high divorce rate in this country. I would say the number one reason why the divorce rate is so high, it's not from infidelity. Whenever I say that to women, they're like, well, it's because men cheat. It's like, no, I actually think the majority of the divorce rate actually has to do with obesity. I think that's a massive problem in this country that's just getting progressively worse. The further and further we get away from a survival scenario, and the easier it is for us to just inhale calories. You can go on Postmates and have you can be on a minimum wage diet, on minimum wage salary, and order enough Oreos to kill yourself. We're just like, we can order calories. We can order more calories in one day delivered to our apartment with like a triple cheese Whataburger than an entire Inuit tribe could have the number of calories they could have in an entire week. That's the world that we live in now. So as we get further and further away from a survival scenario, we have more men that become less useful because of the attributes they have are not as useful in society. And as women make more and more money, they now have a dilemma of choice because they're choosing a smaller and smaller cohort of men to choose from. They're picking from a smaller and smaller cohort of men. And then it's so funny because you'll go on these dating shows or panel shows and you'll hear women complaining about men who cheat, when you actually find out that the number of men who cheat is extremely small, especially when you're dealing with lower status men or lower income men. So I just think that's the place where we're at now. And because of that, women price, Orion Taraban has one of the best explanations of this. Women price sex as, I want commitment before I have sex. Men price sex at, I want sex before I get commitment. And because the price of sex is so different between the two genders, never the two shall meet. And we're seeing the lowest rate of fertility, the lowest rate of marriage, and the lowest rate of people just having sex in general at any point we've ever seen. This generation shows more, i.e., thirst trap photos and OnlyFans and Instagram. They show more than any other generation. They actually have sex the least of any generation.
Wow, there's a lot there, Michael, to pull apart, man. That take on divorces and obesity being a driver, man. I've never heard that perspective on it. But as you're kind of explaining it, it's like, man, it's so true. I heard a wild.
Are you ever going to tell your marriage therapist the reason why I left her was because she's fat? Are you ever going to say that?
Me personally, probably. I probably would never let it get there. Like, I'd probably tell her as she's packing the weight on, hey, you're getting a little too out of fat. Like, you're getting a little too.
The reason why we don't see it, because the top three indicators are, I believe it's infidelity, a lack of, help with the household tasks, and then men losing their jobs. I think those are like the top three as far as reasons why women file for divorce. But I actually think obesity is in there too. And I just think a lot of women just don't want to say, I left my husband because he got fat.
Well, it comes into, how many women say he's changed. He's not the man I fell in love with. He lost his drive. He lost his motivation. A byproduct, a guy losing his job probably stems from a series of poor choices and behavior stacked up over time. As the weight gets put on, you have a little less drive to go to work. Then you're not showing up. You're not staying late. You're not putting in the extra effort. Now you take a pay cut. Now you lose a job. All this time you were putting 40, 50, 60 pounds on. So I definitely can see how it's playing a huge role. I've never actually.
But Frank, I keep watching movies where I'm told that money isn't everything, that I shouldn't worry so much about money. And then I do that. And then all of a sudden, like you said before, it's like, if you guys want to know what's going to happen, if you lose your job, get ready, because your girlfriend's going to say, we grew apart. That's the answer that's coming next, because that's the way a lot of times they have to rationalize it in their own head. And it's the same thing. I just think that one of the main differences, men and women, we're both very complicated creatures. It's just that men are a little bit closer to their attraction triggers. We actually know what our attraction triggers are. If you like a big butt, men will say they like a big butt. For women, they will literally say, I like a guy who's nice, but you keep seeing them date Chad, the male stripper. And they're like, but wait a second, I thought you said you like a guy who's nice. Or they say, I like guys who are smart. I love it when women say, I love men who read. And then I see the guys that they choose to date. And it's like, this guy hasn't read a book. since he got out of
Since high
prison.
school.
No, he hasn't read a book since he got out of prison and got that tattoo sleeve. He hasn't read a single book. And you sit there and listen to them keep talking about they're sapiosexual. So I'm saying it doesn't make women bad. It's just for some reason, women seem to be a little like 1 or 2 deviations away from what their actual attraction triggers are. Whereas men, we know exactly what our attraction triggers are because we're visual. And so I think because of that, that's why you see some of these panel shows where women will say something and then do something else.